Hello, everybody. Michael, the Librarian of Magic here, finding and cataloging the magical and pointing you to it. I'm back once again to review some Disney original content. This is week 3 of the Disney original series episodes, and I'm just going to jump right in. I've watched them all today, and I will jump right into those. As always, there will be a separate video for The Mandalorian, so stay tuned for that. I will be producing that after I get done with this. So I'm going to jump straight in with my notes here, as usual, my notebook, and get going about what the week's episodes hold. This week on The World According to Jeff Goldblum, Jeff investigates the world of tattoos and goes to a whole bunch of interesting places, talks to interesting people about that. He kind of wants to know what would inspire somebody to get a tattoo, as he doesn't have any, and he's trying to understand that world a little bit better for himself. So he goes to a convention. There's also a tattoo competition. He goes to Hawaii to talk to Hawaiian people about their traditional tattoos in their culture and the traditional practice of what they mean and how they put them on and what all the traditional cultural aspects of that are. And then he also, in a highly amusing segment towards the end of the episode, he's from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Pittsburgh has every year a Jeff Goldblum Day to honor their native son. And he goes to Jeff Goldblum Day, and part of the celebration of this year is that there's a local tattoo shop that is giving people that want them Jeff Goldblum tattoos, Jeff Goldblum related tattoos from images from his different movies and all kinds of stuff like that. So he goes and shows up and makes everybody happy by appearing at the place. And then also one of the guys who's getting a Jeff Goldblum inspired tattoo of a dinosaur head from Jurassic Park with Jeff Goldblum glasses on it. Jeff Goldblum steps in for a little bit and puts some of the ink into that guy's tattoo. He takes the tattoo gun and does a couple of lines of that tattoo, so he helps adhere one of the tattoos. So it's really interesting. As usual, Jeff Goldblum, in his inimitable style, is always entertaining to watch. So that's this week's World According to Jeff Goldblum. Sorry, my nose is so itchy right now. The episode this week of Encore is highlighting a cast that performed The Sound of Music from 1992 in Flint, Michigan at Flint Central High, which the high school actually no longer exists. The building is still there, but all that's really left of the school is pretty much the spirit that's inside of these people that are performing this rendition of The Sound of Music. It just continues to be a very touching reality show. It's a show about second chances and about, the things that we do in high school that we are maybe regretful of because we weren't adults yet. And, all those things are wrapped up into that. Coming home again is also an aspect. A lot of these people went away from their town and haven't come back for almost 30 years. So all those things are interesting about the show. And then, of course, they put on The Sound of Music. And there's some interesting things with that. They don't have enough, from a technical side, a theater side of things, they don't have enough people in their returning cast for all of the roles. So they have some people pulling double duty on some of the roles. And that makes for interesting bits with costume changes and pulling off the technical aspects of it. But again, as usual, if you're a theater person, I think you'd really enjoy the show. And even if you're not, I think there's touching moments. Anybody who's gone to high school, I think, can relate to people having to, do something that involves reliving your past, dredging up your past, that sort of thing. I think these people are very brave for not only trying to put on a musical in 5 days, but for confronting aspects of their past and things like that. It's still a good show. Encore. Still no Pixar in Real Life episode this week. There's still only the Inside Out consoles in the park. I kind of figured they would be releasing more weekly episodes of this, and I don't know, maybe they just maybe they didn't make as many episodes, so they're just spacing them out more, so it'll be sort of like a half season, if you will. But I'll let you know if there are ever any more of those. On Disney Family Sundays this week, the DIY Craft Show in honor of Frozen 2, which comes out in theaters today, there is a Frozen 2 inspired craft where the Green family, mom, dad, two daughters, make these Frozen inspired soaps. And the show tells you everything that you need in order to reproduce the craft yourself. Although, on this particular episode, I will say this is probably the least accessible craft so far for everybody. Um, One of the things that it requires is a laminator so that you print these like snowflake diamond elemental things from Frozen 2 on from the internet, and then you laminate them, because if you don't, then it won't withstand the transfer being put onto the soap making process, which is all well and good. But I don't think very many people, unless you're really crafty or that sort of thing, just have a laminator lying around at your home. And if you don't, I don't suspect that you're probably going to want to invest in a laminator just for this project. So if this is something that you're sort of interested in casually, this might not be the most accessible project for you. But if you're already trying to plan on being super crafty and you just want to add a laminator to your craft arsenal and you need an excuse, maybe this will provide you with one. Or otherwise, you are a really crafty person and you already have one, and this is perfectly accessible for you. But this just doesn't seem quite as accessible for everybody as the others, but still a fun craft project and an interesting tie-in with Frozen 2. On the Marvel Hero Project this week, another very inspiring young human, Adonis from Phoenix, Arizona. His backstory is that he is blind. He was born with sight, but developed glaucoma at a really young age, I think 4 or 5 years old, and totally lost his eyesight. But he has adapted to those challenges and now plays football on his high school football team and basketball team and stuff like that. This mainly highlights his skill at football. He is a running back for his team. He doesn't play on a unified team or Special Olympics team or anything like that. It's the usual high school football team, and he's actually pretty successful as sort of like a short yardage back, a third down guy, or a red zone running back. He's scored a few touchdowns in his first season. One of the things that I think makes him really difficult to bring down is that because he can't see anything, he runs pretty fearlessly. He's able to remember the plays and all that stuff. That's how he's able to navigate himself. The quarterback hands him off the ball, which points him in the right direction, and then from hearing his teammates around him, from hearing his blockers and everything like that, he already knows which direction to go. And then once he does, it's just a matter of running as hard as you can. And because he can't see, he runs pretty hard, pretty fearlessly. There's nothing that slows him down, and I think that makes him pretty hard to bring down. So as a result, he's usually really good in those sort of more short down, third down, short yardage, or red zone situations where you need to bring in a guy to almost guarantee yourself a couple yards. He seems to be, at least at the high school level, pretty good at that. He does have ambitions for playing college ball and hopefully one day pro ball, and who knows if that will happen, but I totally appreciate that he is dreaming that big. And if he continues with his skill set and bulks up a little bit more and continues to grow, I mean, he's still a young man, then I don't see any reason why, at least, I mean, there's lots of colleges in our country. I don't see any reason why one wouldn't take a chance on him as like I say, a short yardage or a third down back or something like that. If he continues to improve his skill set, then the sky's the limit. And if he doesn't ever make it to 4-star, 5-star college ball or pros or anything like that, he's already done something amazingly admirable playing on his high school team. He just comes from a very competitive background. His dad was I think a professional athlete. His mom was a professional cheerleader for the Phoenix Cardinals, as well as I want to say a basketball star in her high school. His brothers are football players, so there's a very competitive athletic streak in his family, and he is no different than anybody else in his family. Very competitive, very driven, very athletic, and doesn't let the lack of eyesight slow him down one bit. It's again, a really inspiring episode. Really enjoying this show, just to have a nice breath of fresh air of young people overcoming obstacles, young people being driven to do things. It's just a really hopeful show about future generations, and there's really touching moments in it, and just a really great episode. So that's about Adonis being inducted into the Marvel Hero Project. This week on Forky Ask a Question, Forky wants to know, what is art? And he is aided by Master Thespian Mr. Pricklepants, the hedgehog, who helps him try to understand acting and theater and what art actually is. And as usual, there starts to become a theme in this short form series where, like, Forky really understands. Like, he said, he'll towards one point in the episode, pretty much each time, he'll say something really poignant and meaningful, demonstrating that he understands the concept of the question that he's just asked, but then he doesn't actually understand that he understands, so he just sort of moves on again. Anyway, Forky, hilarious, great installment of what Forky Asks a Question. My favorite installment so far is still What is a Friend, episode 2, but What is Art, also really funny with the hedgehog Mr. Pricklepants, who we haven't seen yet in the series. On the High School Musical, the series, this week's episode is called The Wonder Studies, and it really has a couple of there's pretty much highlighting 3 different adversarial relationships. You have the sort of competition arising between Nina and Gina as they struggle for their role of Gabriella, or Nini already has the role of Gabriella, but Gina really wants it, and they're messing with each other throughout the whole thing. EJ and Ricky, and their sort of adversarial relationship about the role of Troy, but more importantly, sort of underneath that, their relationship with Nini. And then also Miss Jen and Mr. Mazzara, who's the school's robotics club teacher guy. And he sort of seems to be finding out some evidence that Miss Jen is not who she says she is, that she's not like an accredited teacher. And he's sort of kind of finding dirt on her, but backs off a little because he kind of goes after her, tries to find dirt on her because her musical has stolen kids from his robotics club, and if he doesn't have a quorum in the robotics club, then they can't take a trip to China or something like that. And then when he sees the progress all these kids are making in the musical, he kind of backs off a little bit because he's impressed by what Miss Jen has been able to achieve. But I have a feeling that we're maybe not done with that particular storyline. Then EJ, who I don't know if I mentioned in the last episode, his cousin is a character called Ashlyn, and she's the girl who is writing original songs. She's playing the music teacher in the musical. She sung a song in the last episode. She's his cousin, and she sort of inadvertently helps EJ come in contact with Nini's phone, even though she doesn't want to. EJ is this, like, he's really untrusting of what's going on with Nini and Ricky, and so he's trying to spy on her, so he swipes her phone, and he's listening to and deleting voicemails and doing all kinds of, terrible stuff. If you actually want to show that you are trustworthy of your girlfriend, these are things you would not want to do. And then when he has a chance to sort of come clean about things, he doesn't, and that's kind of an aspect of the episode, that he's digging himself deeper by lying about having swiped the phone and all that stuff. The other aspect of the phone thing is Nini believing that Gina stole her phone to sort of get back at her for having gotten the lead role of Gabriella. Nini ends up stealing a bunch of stuff that belongs to Gina, her shoes, her books, her laptop, and her friend Courtney helps her, steal all this stuff. At first she just steals the shoes, and then she thinks, stealing the shoes is wrong, so I'm going to give them back. And then before she does, Courtney is like, hey, I got your bag, girl, and she, stole all of Gina's stuff, a whole bag full of stuff. And it just becomes this whole thing. And then the episode kind of leaves you on a cliffhanger in the end, where Nini gives Gina all of her stuff back and confronts her and says, look, I'm not going to let you push me around. I'm sorry I stole all your stuff, but I'm not going to let you intimidate me. And, you know, even though you stole my phone and all that stuff. And Gina says, I didn't steal your phone. And then she runs into Ricky, and Ricky tells her, look, I left you a really, like, embarrassing message on your phone, because he'd left her a message earlier in the episode that he was, like, pining for her and being like, I don't know if we had a moment or not, but if we did, you know, you can ignore this message if you don't, I know you probably don't like me anymore. Um, and EJ intercepts that message and deletes it because he's jealous or whatever. And then he confronts her about that and says, look, or EJ confronts him. They get into a fight, and EJ tells Ricky, stop leaving thirsty messages on my girlfriend's voicemail. And he says, okay, I'm sorry, whatever, I'm backing off. And then he confronts Nene. Ricky confronts Nene and says, look, I'm sorry that I know you don't like me anymore. I'm sorry for leaving you these messages, but could you at least not tell EJ about it? I don't need him confronting me in the halls and telling me that I'm horrible. And Nene's like, what message? What are you talking about? I never received any voicemail from you. And then she slowly puts two and two together. It dawns on her, EJ is the one that stole the phone. But that's where the episode ends. So I'm assuming that one of the things that will kick off the next episode is Nene confronting EJ about why he stole her phone and why he's spying on her and why he's being a jerk. There's some funny elements in this episode too. EJ tries to write an original song to apologize to Nene for stealing the phone, and it's not very good, and that's one of the reasons why he can't work up the courage to just say, look, I'm sorry, I'm a jerk, and I've been behaving horribly, but you know how high schoolers do. So those are the interesting teenage ins and outs of High School Musical, the series this week. Finally, this week I watched the Imagineering story, the third episode of which is entitled The Midas Touch. We left off in the early 80s in the second episode after the building of Epcot and Tokyo Disney, and this episode picks up in 1984 when Michael Eisner takes over as CEO of the Disney Company and Frank Wells takes over as president and COO of the Disney Company. And then it kind of very briefly highlights that there were a bunch of hostile takeovers trying to happen at that time, and that they brought in Eisner and Frank Wells because they were like guys with experience in the movie business, and the animation side, the studio side of the Disney Company wasn't doing well at that time, but that was what they were really knowledgeable about, to try to help turn the movie aspects of everything around, which they did. And then it kind of highlights their experience with the theme parks, which Frank Wells and Michael Eisner had less experience with, but how they kind of came to be more invested in theme park projects, building Euro Disney, which eventually became Disneyland Paris, as well as Disney MGM Studios in Florida, which eventually became Hollywood Studios. And it goes through the highlighting of how the Imagineers were involved in those projects, as well as opening Star Tours at Disneyland with George Lucas, and the opening of that, which happened in the early 80s, and Videopolis, which is like a teenage dance club that opened up in Disneyland, as well as Captain EO, which is a 3D movie with Michael Jackson. They go over the building of Splash Mountain during that era, as well as a bunch of other stuff, including one thing that I thought was really... I didn't know hardly anything about Disneyland Paris or Euro Disney as far as the specifics of it. I had a brief chance to go there last year, and my plans changed, so I didn't end up doing that. Maybe I'll get there sometime. But there were things I didn't know about it, like their Space Mountain is totally different. Their whole Tomorrowland, which is called Discoveryland, has got like a steampunk Jules Verne vibe, and their Space Mountain has like a catapult launch to mimic Journey to the Moon by Jules Verne, where there are guys that are basically shot out of a cannon into the moon, and that's kind of like one of the elements of the Space Mountain at Discoveryland at Disneyland Paris. Also, their Big Thunder Mountain Railroad is more of a focal point of their Fantasyland as opposed to the other Disney parks. And they also did a lot of artistry with stained glass, and they kind of spent a lot more money on the building of the park than they did the other ones. They kind of wanted to cater to the more European style, eye for detail. And so they talk about that. They bring in a guy who's an expert on stained glass, and he was one of the people who pretty much orchestrated a full restoration on Notre Dame Cathedral at one point in the 80s or 90s, I think. And he came out of retirement specifically to help build Euro Disney. And all of those things were very interesting. I think that this episode was a little bit more of a struggle for me than the other ones, and I think it's because the show struggles with the balancing act of um, it struggles with the balancing act of knowing what to focus on or what it's about. I think there are times where so it's called the Imagineering story, so it should be about the story of the Imagineering department, which in this era became known as Walt Disney Imagineering. Before that, it was WED Enterprises, which was a company that Walt Disney started to develop Imagineering, and he started calling them all Imagineers, and they sort of became unofficially known as that. And then in the Michael Eisner era, they came to be known as Walt Disney Imagineering as a company. And that's really what this should be about, and it is what it's about. But there are times where, in an effort to, in order to tell the story of the Imagineers, you have to contextualize it, right? You have to put in elements of like, well, at that time, this is what was going on in the Disney company. Michael Eisner took over the company. This is what the company was facing, and all of those things. You have to give a context to what's happening so that you understand what the Imagineers are trying to accomplish or what their challenges are, and that'll make sense to me. But I feel like this episode and at times in the other episodes, this documentary is doing things like backwards in a sense, where rather than telling the Imagineering story and contextualizing that with the sort of history of what's going on with Disney as a company, and letting that be sort of a background to the Imagineering story. To me, what it really often feels like, especially in this episode, it feels like they're telling the Disney story. They're telling the history of the Disney company with the Imagineering story as a background to the history of the Disney company. And I feel like, in a lot of ways, it seems like Leslie Iwerks really wanted to make a documentary about the history of the Disney company and how that specifically relates to the building of all the different parks. But I feel like if you're going to have a thing that's called the Imagineering story and make it about those people, then that's what it should be about. It should be the other way around. It should be, here's everything that's going on in detail with the Imagineers, and here are the challenges that they're up against. And then in the background, you talk about, oh, Michael Eisner became the CEO and all that stuff. But there's a lot of elements in this show that are really about what was going on with the company and Michael Eisner, and like long chunks of stuff that's like, what does this really have to do with the Imagineers? It's very interesting, don't get me wrong. Part of the problem with telling the story that way, to making the documentary that way, is then you automatically want to know more. There's a segment where when they were opening Euro Disney, a lot of the French public was not very happy with that, and they rioted at like some opening ceremony, and they were throwing eggs and stuff at Michael Eisner, and they show all of this stuff in a very sort of brief spot because this is what happened, that they're rebelling against Disney and Western American culture and all of that stuff. But what does that have to do with Imagineering? That's a challenge that Disney faced as a company, and that's a challenge that France and America have with each other, and that's a challenge that Michael Eisner had to face. But that doesn't have anything to do with what the Imagineers had to face when they were building Euro Disney, or what they had. I wanted to, if it's going to be the Imagineering story, I want it to be more specific to their company, to their department, about what sorts of things they were up against. And it does get to some of those things here and there, but you could spend a whole lot more depth on the Imagineers if you spend a little bit less time on, so here's what was going on with the company. Another segment where that happens is they talk about the building of Splash Mountain, and they do go into some really cool details about what all went into that ride, about how there was a thing in Bear Country back in the day called America Sings that had all of these singing animatronics that were from the film Song of the South, and that's how they sort of got the idea to repurpose them into Splash Mountain when they were building that as a water ride. So that's why it ended up becoming sort of Song of the South themed, with Zippity Doodah and all that stuff. And they very briefly say in there, like, Song of the South is a problematic movie, and then they built this thing in the late 80s, early 90s. And it's like, well, you could make a whole episode, you could make a whole documentary on how Song of the South is problematic, and that they built a thing anyway because they were trying to repurpose animatronics from some other thing, and because Disney's, inextricably linked with the song Zippity Doodah, and like all kinds of other stuff that goes into that. And they don't stray down that path because rightly, that's not what this documentary is about. But I also think it doesn't behoove you to also just bring that stuff up and then gloss over it, because these are all like super nuanced, super complex things. If you're going to bring up Splash Mountain in the context of the Imagineers, then I would rather you just sort of keep a focus on that. These were the challenges that we had building it. Oh, we built this ride, and we repurposed these animatronics. And if they have something to say about the thought process that went into why it was problematic with Song of the South and all that stuff, then great. I'm not saying we should gloss over that or we should leave it out. That would be disingenuous to do so. But I feel like it's equally disingenuous or wrong-headed in a sense, to just sort of have Angela Bassett in voiceover say, yeah, Song of the South's a problematic movie and they built this anyway, and then move on. Like, then you're just sort of glossing over it as well. So I find that there's sort of problems in this documentary at times where it doesn't know what story it wants to tell. It doesn't know whether or not it's about what it's about sometimes. And that's not to say that it isn't interesting or in well edited and well shot and all those sorts of things, or that the interviews aren't very compelling. I think there's a lot to like in this series and even in this episode. It doesn't stumble as often as I'm probably making it sound, but when it does, it feels pretty glaring to me that there are focus. It needs to come back into focus here and there, and hopefully a lot of those issues are contained to this episode. I will say that I felt like it struggled with those focusing issues more in this episode than any other episodes, and hopefully that's just by nature of what this episode was about, and or maybe because feels like it's sort of one big piece, that there will be more episodes in the future as you get closer to the end of it where it sort of ties everything together in a better way. I'm willing to give all those things a benefit of the doubt and withhold overall judgment about the entire piece until it's done. But in this individual episode, I had some issues with focus, but also this episode contained a lot of stuff that compared to the other episodes that I never knew about, and I did learn a lot, and there's really compelling footage and interesting things going on in here. So if that sounds like it's of interest to you, I would say continue to stick with it. I'm planning on doing so, and I'm hoping that the project is able to stick the landing and sort of bring the whole Imagineering story and the whole Imagineering department and everything back into focus, back into front and center in this. And with all the footage that's being cobbled together and being used for this, I don't think that Leslie Iwerks is a bad filmmaker by any means. So I do hope that if she does want to tell more stories about the history of Disney, that this is a launching off point, because I just feel like that's a story she's itching to tell, but that is not in the scope or view of this particular documentary. And so cuts have to be made here or there, and that's a challenge that she's obviously facing and handles it well most of the time, but sometimes I don't see it. So that's the Imagineering story. I know that was kind of a rant. I hope it wasn't overly negative. I'm not trying to be, but those are just things that sort of struck me from a critical standpoint as I was watching this particular episode. That is everything for Disney original content this week, saving The Mandalorian, which I will make another episode about here shortly. Thank you for liking, commenting, and subscribing. Let me know what you think about this stuff if you've been following along, if any of these episodes were interesting to you, or if there's anything that's going to be coming down the pike, Disney Originals-wise, that you're interested in, or even things that aren't original. What have you been watching on the service? Anything that you could recommend or things you want to bring to my attention? Feel free to comment below. Let me know. Thanks as always for watching these. I will see you in the next video. Have an excellent day. Have a magical day. And I'll see you again. Bye-bye.